My name is Melissa Deckman. I'm the CEO of Public Religion Research Institute. I am very delighted to be welcoming some special guests, some award-winning political scientists who are going to share some of their insights into our latest survey findings. Joining us today are Chris Parker. He is a professor of political science at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He's also the Chief Executive Officer of Black Insights Research. And among his books include Fighting for Democracy, Black Veterans and the Struggle Against White Supremacy in the Post-War South by Princeton University Press. It was the winner of the APSA's Ralph Bunche Award. He also is the co-author of Change They Can't Believe In, The Tea Party and Reactionary Politics in America by Princeton University Press with Matt Barreto, which also won another APSA award. And he's currently working on a book called The Great White Hope, Donald Trump, Race and the Crisis of American Democracy. We're also delighted to have Efrén Pérez from UCLA, where he is the professor of political science and psychology. He also directs the lab on race, ethnicity, politics, and society, and co-directs its intergroup relations lab. He released 2 books in 2021, not to be outdone, 2 in 1 year, including Diversity's Child, People of Color and the Politics of Identity, as well as Racial Order with Enya Kyo, Racialized Responses, Inter-Minority Politics in a Diverse Nation. And his latest book with Margit Tavits is titled Voicing Politics, How Language Shapes Public Opinion, which received the 2023 Robert E. Lane Best Book in Political Psychology from APSA. So again, welcome today. We're really excited to hear your insights into our findings from today's surveys. I'm happy also to introduce our founder and president of PRRI, Robbie Jones. He, of course, is the president of our organization. He's also the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future, as well as White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, which won a 2021 American Book Award, and also The End of White Christian America, which won the 2019 Bremer Award in Religion. Robbie, of course, writes regularly in all kinds of outlets. He also has a terrific Substack called White Too Long, where he writes about the truth-telling, repair, and healing from the legacy of white supremacy in American Christianity. So without further ado, I'm going to pass along the baton to Robbie, who's going to profile some of our major findings from this exciting new survey. Robbie.
Great. Well, hi, everybody. Greetings on a Friday at noon. And just want to say we're releasing this is our first post-election data. So we're in the field right after the election. And then have just been scrambling to kind of collect the data, crunch the data, and now it is kind of being unleashed into the wild today. And it was a big national election, and I'm just happy that we've got coast to coast coverage among our panelists today. So we've got from California to DC here to kind of give us some perspective. So thanks, Efrén and Chris, for being with us today. So I'm going to jump in and share some slides that just get you the kind of very tip of the iceberg of what we found. There's a lot more coming. We'll be unloading some more slices of the data later, but this is really our first look that we wanted to get out as soon as we could after the election today. So with that, let me share my screen. All right, so let's jump in. I should say these findings are up on the PRRI website at prri.org. So you can see them all there, including all the graphs that I'm going to be showing you here in the slide today. So this was a fairly large survey. We were in the field November 8th, so right after the election until December 2nd. It's a representative sample of 5,772 adults who are part of the Ipsos Knowledge Panel. So it is a random probability survey. Margin of error for the full sample, plus or minus 1.7 percentage points. The data we're going to be showing today is among people who self-reported that they voted. So we're going to look at a subsample of voters here. It is still 44,757 voters. Margin of error for that voter subset is plus or minus 1.9 percentage points. So first of all, let's kind of go to the presidential election. I have a few slides here. This one is no surprise. This is basically how partisans reported their vote in the 2024 election. I think the main thing to point out here is that partisans voted pretty much along party lines with very few either Republicans or Democrats cross voting. We did have independents leaning slightly more toward Kamala Harris than toward Donald Trump, but we had that kind of strong turnout among Republican voters that in the end, had Trump edge out Harris in the national vote. So that's kind of just partisans there. Also wanted to look at kind of class and race here. And so first of all, to say there's been a lot of data about this leading into the election, but we find among white voters, it is a 22-point gap and we're measuring class by those who have a four-year college degree versus those who do not. Whites without a college degree, 66% for Trump versus only 44% for Trump among whites with a college education. And put up the numbers here for Latino and Black voters as well. There is a gap that's in the same direction, but as you can see, it's much, much smaller among both Latino and Black voters. It's really only 8 percentage points here. So non-college graduates more likely to vote for Trump among both Latino and Black voters. But again, the vote is very small. And even among, if you kind of look particularly at African-American voters, even among non-college graduates, it's only 20%, right, that supported for Trump versus 66% of whites with who are non-college graduates. So if you look at the kind of working class divide between white and Black voters, it is just a chasm. It's 46 percentage points between those two groups. One other thing, we here at PRRI focus on kind of religion. So we've got our first look in this post-election survey at vote by religion. I'm going to first put up here the groups that voted majority for Donald Trump. It is overwhelmingly white Christian groups with one exception, and that is Latino Protestants here. No surprise, white evangelical Protestants, 85%. They have been 8 and 10 or more for Donald Trump every time he has been on the ticket. And in fact, one of the more remarkable things about the religious landscape is how little things have changed since kind of 2016, 2020, and 2024. Looks relatively stable. These groups that I'm showing here were the same groups in 2016 that supported Trump in majority levels as well. And we did see a little bit of an uptick among Latino Protestants here. But the other two look fairly stable. And then the other groups, and they're basically other Christians of color, non-Christian religious groups, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, etc., and the religiously unaffiliated on the other side. And here are the numbers for those. Latino Catholics, again, we did see a little bit of an uptick among Latino Catholics, but still far less than a majority support for Trump at 43%. And you can kind of see everything down here. I will point out African-American Protestants way down here. They are essentially mirror images of white evangelical Protestants. And we're used to seeing that, but I do want to just pause and say how remarkable that is. African-American Protestants, white evangelical Protestants share a lot of theology, share a lot of geography, geographical location, and yet just really mirror opposites of each other in their voting patterns, and have been, particularly in the Trump era, really, and really since the civil rights era, have settled out. We've seen this voting pattern among African Americans. I do want to point out one thing. Our Latino Catholic numbers here are significantly different than at least than the NEP exit poll numbers that actually showed Latino Catholics voting majority for Trump. I actually think that's not correct. I didn't see any pre-election polling showing anywhere near that kind of support for Trump among Latino Catholics. And indeed, our post-election survey here shows them a little bit of an uptick, but nowhere near majority support. I think this is probably the more accurate number for Latino Catholics out of the election. So one other thing I wanted to point out is that there's been, there was this kind of one of these myths that just won't die, that is it came to be called the God gap in voting. And it was essentially saying the more likely you attended religious services, the more likely you were to vote Republican. That is largely true among white Americans here. And so you can see I put two groups of white Christian voters here. And you can see among white evangelical Protestants, the more likely you were to go to church, the more likely you were to support Donald Trump. It is also true among white Catholics. The more likely you were to go to church, the more likely you were to support Donald Trump. There is one little caveat, though, and that is among the non-evangelical Protestants who are white. Those typically the mainline Protestants, think Episcopalian, Presbyterian, and the like. And here, the pattern actually is reversed. They're slightly less likely to support Trump. And that pattern is consistent with African-American support as well. I don't have the chart here, but among African-Americans, that is true as well. The more likely you are to go to church, the less likely you are to support Donald Trump. So I want to kind of make sure we understand this nuance, that it is overwhelmingly true. The positive correlation is overwhelmingly true among white evangelicals and white Catholics. It is somewhat true among Latinos as well, but among the non-evangelical Protestants, and particularly among African Americans, it is not true. So we kind of want to make sure we get that nuance in. One other thing that we have been measuring at PRRI are 3 different scales. We have a Christian nationalism scale, a right-wing authoritarianism scale, and a QAnon scale. I'm not going to go into the methodology about how these scales are created, but they're essentially clusters of questions that all scale very consistently together. And then we categorize people as essentially scoring higher on one end of the scale than the other. And I wanted to kind of see how these shake out. So here is the vote for Donald Trump among each of these groups. You can see very, very distinct patterns. So those who are more likely to support Christian nationalism overwhelmingly support for Donald Trump. Those who are more likely to score high or very high on our right-wing authoritarianism scale overwhelmingly more likely to support Trump. And among QAnon, those who believe the kind of QAnon conspiracy, we have kind of these categories: believers, doubters, and rejectors. Again, very positive correlation. And again, in all of these, if you're on the high end of these scales, you're about 8 and 10 likely to support Trump in the election. So finally, I want to kind of flip over to kind of how people felt about the election. Not surprisingly, Republicans, it was a closed-in question: excited, satisfied, disappointed, worried, angry, or people could write in other as well. But as you can see here, Republicans overwhelmingly either excited or satisfied, although more satisfied than excited about the reelection of Trump. It's way down in single digits of positive emotions among Democrats. And here are the numbers on the other side. I should say there's no group in the country sort of more worried or angry than African-American voters. Here, if you look at disappointed, worried, and angry, it's 75% of African-Americans in those kind of negative categories of voters. So this one's kind of interesting. We had a question about whether people were confident that the election was conducted fairly and accurately. Again, this is after the election, so the results are in when people are answering this survey. Interestingly enough, we have Republicans, 2/3 this time, saying they thought that they were very confident that the election was conducted fairly and accurately. Drops down among independents, and it's less than a majority among Democrats. But I do want to compare this to this other question here, and that is, again, same survey, those who continue to believe that the 2020 election was stolen. So in other words, not conducted fairly and accurately. And you can see this remarkable kind of paradoxical position among Republicans that with their candidate winning in 2020, I don't think it's any mystery, with their candidate winning, yes, of course, the election was conducted fairly. With their candidate losing, it's 2-1 saying that they believe the election was stolen from Donald Trump. We had another question here about whether God ordained Trump. So a kind of providential question. God ordained Trump to be the winner of the 2024 presidential election. We see overwhelmingly white evangelical Protestants are really the only religious group that is in majority territory, but Latino Protestants divided on the question. But every other group is not quite willing to go that far to say that God ordained Trump. But white evangelicals are there. And down at the bottom here, we have our 2 categories of Christian nationalism scale, either the adherents or sympathizers, those who kind of support Christian nationalism. It's about 6 and 10 who agree that this was a kind of God-ordained outcome in the presidential election. So a few things here about how people are viewing the party and other threats to democracy. We asked this question about what people say about political parties in 2016 and in 2024, and we asked people whether they thought political parties were basically heading, had the country heading in the right direction, whether they were kind of in error, or whether they posed a serious threat to democracy. So I'm only showing the side of posing a serious threat to democracy. In 2016, Republicans said 60% of Republicans said that the Democratic Party posed a serious threat to the country. About a third of independents said that, and only 5% of Democrats said that about their own party, not surprisingly. And then on the flip side, it was only 5% of Republicans saying that about their own party, a quarter of independents, but half of Democrats saying that about the Republican Party. So that's 2016 data and the fall of 2016. Here is the same question asked in our post-election survey, and you can see it's essentially gone up in both cases. It's 69% of the Republican Party saying they believe that 69% say Republicans say the Democratic Party poses a serious threat. But if you look down here on the bottom, you see this big jump about what Democrats think about the Republican Party. And it has gone from 50% to 81% of Democrats saying that they believe the Republican Party poses a serious threat to democracy. But in both cases, we've got each party saying that about, majority saying that about the other party, and it's gone up in 2024. This one's kind of interesting. We had a question about whether the biggest dangers we face are not from outsiders, but those who are living among us who want to destroy our country. So it's kind of our attempt to get at this kind of enemies within language. It turns out that people, I think, are loading different things into this question, and we actually see not a lot of difference across parties, but high concerns about internal threats really across political parties. And then we had a series of questions I'll go through fairly quickly here about what people thought about the future. Will our democracy remain strong? What kinds of things do they anticipate Trump may or may not do in the coming years? And so here's the first one. Our democracy will remain strong over the next 4 years. We have only 4 in 10 voters saying that they are very confident of that. So this is just the very confident side of that. Of course, super majorities of Republicans, but only a third of independents, only 5% of Democrats. You can also see big racial divides here on this question. Whites are essentially divided largely along educational lines. So about a third of those who are multiracial, Latino, identify as AAPI, and only about 16% of African Americans say they're very confident democracy will remain strong. And then if we do this Christian nationalism measure again, with 7 in 10 of those who affirm the tenets of Christian nationalism, but only 3 in 10 of those who reject those tenets of Christian nationalism being confident. So not a high level of confidence, heavily divided along party and racial lines. Here's one about kind of freedom of expression. Will people be able to freely express their political opinions, even if they differ from the incoming presidential administration? Again, only about 4 in 10 voters saying they are exceptionally confident. Almost the same patterns here among both party and race, and very similar numbers around Christian nationalist adherents and rejectors as well. This one about retaliation. Will Donald Trump use the power of the government to punish his enemies? To keep this all in the same direction, we've kind of reversed, presenting the inverse here. These are people who are not at all confident. It's about a little more than a third of voters who are not at all confident that Trump will use the power of the government to punish his enemies, or don't think this is going to happen. Again, 6 in 10 Republicans, only 6% of Democrats. We see that again, these big divides by race, and big divides by adherence to Christian nationalism as well. And then finally, will Donald Trump leave peacefully after his term is over? Here again, only 4 in 10 voters say they're very confident that Trump will peacefully leave office at the end of his term. Republicans believe he's going to do that. Very few Democrats believe it. And pretty much the same patterns here. Although multiracial Americans a little more divided on this one than others, but then again, only 16% of African Americans. Big divides on attitudes around Christian nationalism on this as well. Got two more attitudinal slides. Here's one about whether the U.S. military should put immigrants who are in the country illegally into internment camps. So a pretty extreme question. It's only about a quarter of all voters, but Republicans are basically divided on this question. Nearly as many say yes, they agree, or as say they disagree. A little bit, not quite majority here, but few Democrats and very few or independents as well. Interestingly enough, those who score higher, very high on the right-wing authoritarianism scale are divided on even on this kind of extreme question, kind of right down the middle. Those who score low, almost no support for such a policy looking ahead. And so finally, one that's not about politics exactly, but about what people say they may impact their holiday plans. So we asked this just in the last few weeks. And we asked people whether they agree or disagree that this holiday season, I will be spending less time with certain family members because of their political views. So how far down into people's personal lives is this going to go? It's only about 1 in 10 voters who say that they are changing their holiday plans to spend less time with certain family members over politics. But it is about 1 in 4 Democrats who say this, only about 1 in 10 independents, about 5% of Republicans. So 1 in 4 say that this is really impacting even the way they're going to spend time, Democrats, the way they're going to spend time with their family. So again, this is kind of a very fast march through. We've got a lot more that we'll be unpacking in the coming weeks and months. But this is kind of the top line of what it looks like. And with that, I will turn it back to Melissa.
Thank you, Robbie, for that wonderful presentation. For those of you who are just joining us now, please share your questions for our panelists, and for Robbie, especially that inspired you. That wonderful dive into our data inspired some questions. But we have a Q&A box, so please put your questions in there, and we'll hopefully turn to those toward the end of the program today. But first, I think we're going to turn it to Chris Parker, and then to Efrén to talk about some of their initial reactions from the data, from the PowerPoint, and then I'm going to follow up by talking a little bit more about the role of gender in this election, and before we have a conversation amongst ourselves. So, Chris, why don't you take it away?
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to participate in this august panel. Really appreciate it. Good to see my good friend and colleague and fellow Angelino, Efrén Pérez, on this call. So we only have 5 minutes in which to unpack what we have to say. So I'm going to be very, very brief. And since I'm a specialist in race and politics, I'm really only going to focus on those areas in which, we saw race as a potential cleavage. And those were the items that dealt with, or the questions rather, that dealt with confidence in democracy. And so as I recall, they were sort of divided by, race, party, and I believe Christian nationalism. So as I examine these items, I was paying special attention to race. And there were real tangible differences, and the gap in party ID, like that's where the largest polarization took place, which was no surprise. But when I examined Christian nationalism, there were enormous gaps when it comes to Christian nationalism and confidence in American democracy, as Robbie just showed. And so I guess my question would be, Christian nationalism is doing a lot of work. Again, the gaps were enormous, but I wonder if, how Christian nationalism is examined, like whether or not white Christians and, let's say, Black Christians are conceiving of the same things, right? It just occurs to me, like, given, Robbie's, prior work in this area, that, white Christians have a certain idea of what Christianity looks like, and Black Christians as well. And so one question I wanted to ask is, like, what are those differences rooted in? Like how are these things, how does Christianity present itself for Black folks vis-a-vis white folks? And I have the same sort of question I have taps into what Robbie showed when it comes to, white Protestant and Black Protestants when it comes to voting for Trump. Right. So the same sort of issues come to mind. You have Black Protestants, which were much less likely to support Trump than white Protestants. Right. And so I would say that's one thing I definitely wanted to ask. And then just another small thing is, there's so much here, but another small thing would be sort of like, I don't really do the religion and politics thing too much. Like in my book on the Tea Party, I really kind of gave that the Heisman because that's a part of this debate that I don't really want to get into. But what I'm curious about is like historically, the Black church has been a place, I think, and it's been shown through the sociological and historiography that Black folks, sort of coalesced and used to fight against Jim Crow. And so then I guess my question is, to what extent does that carry over to the present day? And how might that uh, use of the Black church, for lack of a better term, continue to inform Black Christianity to this day vis-a-vis social justice? So and then I had one other question on the use of right-wing authoritarianism and why that and not the sort of authoritarianism that is associated with child rearing. And that's pretty much all I got.
All right. We have written those questions down and we're going to return to them momentarily. So I think we've got some initial answers and some other research we've done that can speak to that. But these are really, I think, good thought-provoking questions. So Efrén, I'm going to hand the floor to you.
All right. Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation. I'm glad to see a bunch of illustrious people here, including my colleague, Chris Parker. Okay, I'm going to make use of the 5 minutes by highlighting 3 sort of points of discussion that have occurred pre-election, post-election, and then try to tie that into how the results of this rich data set might help us either clarify or sort of identify for us the correct questions to be asking. So the first one that I think is sort of jumps out, at least to me, is sort of this alleged shift in Hispanic support for Donald Trump. It's very clear from the survey that whereas we once expected maybe 1 out of 3 Latinos to vote Republican regardless of the candidate, we're basically seeing half, right? And this is sort of corroborated by the results here. The question here is, I think, not to run with this pattern and to say that there has been a shift or a realignment, but to ask sort of more fundamental and even simpler questions. One of those would be, how durable would this change in pattern be? Especially when we consider that Latinos on average are what we consider low propensity voters. Don't pay attention too much, not very interested in politics that much. And so, essentially what could end up happening is we're talking about voters who are essentially kites in the air, where they are highly responsive to the messaging that comes their way during campaigns, in large part because they're still trying to get their political moorings. And so that's sort of one thing to keep in mind, that there might be simpler explanations for why we saw this essentially 50-50 split. The second thing that I think stands out to me is, and this is sort of good for the survey, sort of the differences between Latino Catholics and Latino Protestants. Now, there's a very clear sort of pattern, if I remember, about a 20 percentage point difference between those 2 segments and the corresponding support that Latino Protestants gave to Donald Trump. Now, the reason that I think this is important is that, in the last 2 elections, a lot of us have been scrambling for very splashy explanations at the individual level as to what may be going on. But I think this particular pattern is a nice sort of shred of evidence that part of what is going on is actually much more structural. And this is what I mean. Both parties have been polarizing for the last 30 or so years, right? But this was largely a conversation about polarization's effects on non-Hispanic whites. And I think part of what we're seeing in these last 2 elections is that the consequences of that polarization are filtering down. And the way this manifests in your survey, and I imagine is probably likely to manifest in others, is that what you're seeing is an increased association mentally for a lot of people, Latino or otherwise, between being evangelicals and being Republicans. And I think that convergence between partisan identity and things like your religious identity and other forms of identity is part of what's happening with this change in patterns in the Latino vote. Namely, that a lot of Latinos are now slowly sort of waking up to the fact that the parties are clearly differentiating themselves on lots of identity dimensions, and they're sort of just picking their right team, so to speak. The last thing that I want to point to is, it's really hard to say how much of this change in Latino voting patterns is due to personalistic factors. And this is what I mean. Donald Trump is sort of a quantity and a product all on his own, right? And so it's really hard to tell how much of this support among Latinos has to do with that unique brand of his rather than a very durable, sincere attachment to the Republican Party. Now, what I think the survey sort of provides us with is some really cool data on how these sort of deeper dispositions, like right-wing authoritarianism, might potentially explain some of this change in Latino voting patterns. And going forward, I would just, sort of thread together those findings on right-wing authoritarianism with a bunch of other quite icky, deep predispositions that also do very similar stuff. So one of the things that I'm thinking about here is what is known as system justification, which is very related to right-wing authoritarianism. But the key here is that system justification among people of color is sort of has this paradoxical effect where, because of your racial marginalization, the stresses that produces, you end up affirming the status quo, the way things are, because it's so predictable, it's so clear, etc. For a population where you have immigrants and native-born children of immigrants, something like the American dream, very powerful, but it also sort of encourages that kind of thinking, right? That things are okay, this is great. If you work hard, you can get out. And so I think the way things are, namely lots of racial inequality, I'm going to sort of support this kind of stuff because it's more predictable than me trying to imagine an alternative that, I don't know where it may lead to. And so, those three things, I think, sort of side by side with your data, should be sort of enough to think further about how we explain some of these on the surface paradoxical patterns among Latino voters.
Thank you, Efrén. Really, some really good things to think about moving ahead. So I'm going to weigh in here on my thoughts about our survey findings. One of the areas that I write about a lot is gender. I just recently published a book on the politics of Gen Z as well, which really is a deeper dive into the influence of gender on the youngest voters in this country. And I think in many ways, a lot of people were really surprised by the youth vote this election cycle. So I want to talk about that. But first, I wanted to talk about the overall gender gap in voting, what our findings reveal about that, and then the role of gender attitudes in shaping America's vote choices and what some of our data say about that as well. All right, so turning to our data, I was really interested in seeing what the gender gap overall looked like among Americans. For those of you who follow American politics, we know that really since Reagan's elections in 1980, women have tended to vote more for Democrats, where Republicans have tended to vote more men have tended to vote more for Republican candidates. And that certainly is true with this data set as well. We find that 54% of men voted for Donald Trump compared to 46% of women who voted for Donald Trump. So that's a gap of about 8%. It's pretty commiserate with other gender gaps we've seen historically. Notably, this isn't talked about a lot, but validated voter files in 2020 showed that, in fact, Joe Biden made some inroads with men voters. Like, I was even surprised when I looked at it again, but Biden, 48% of men voted for Biden in 2020 compared to 50% who voted for Trump. But clearly, one trend that we've seen is that Trump did much better this election cycle with men voters and made some slight inroads with women voters as well. The gender gap, of course, though, is different for different groups in society. Among white voters, for example, our data show that the gender gap was about 6%. So 58% of white men voted for Trump compared to 52% of white women. So white women voters, again, tended to historically be Republican, and we saw that happening with this election as well. And there was a gender gap among Latinos and Black voters in addition. So our data are showing that 49% of Latino men voted for Trump compared to 41% of Latino women. And then among Black voters, 22% voting for Trump among Black men, but 13% of Black women voted for Trump. So let me just again say this, Black women voters tend to be the most stalwart supporters of Democrats, and it was true in this election cycle as well. The gender gap also applies to religious voters. So even though the vast majority of white evangelicals we saw from Robbie's PowerPoint voted for Donald Trump, 88% of white evangelical men compared to 82% of white evangelical women voted for Donald Trump. And that gap actually gets bigger among Catholics, white Catholics, and white mainline Protestants. I was sort of interested to find that even though 53% of white Catholic women voted for Donald Trump, a majority, it's almost 2/3 of white Catholic men. So I think that's a really sort of an interesting point that might bear some additional analysis going forward. But no matter how you cut the data, Trump made inroads to almost all groups of voters this election cycle. And except for one exception. I think the one exception is white college-educated women tended to go more for Harris this election cycle, but that's really the only counter indication of trends with respect to voting. I often maintain, though, that even apart from the gender gap, knowing people's attitudes about gender is a lot more important in understanding their voting behavior. And in some ways, attitudes about gender have already filtered themselves, has really kind of filtered out into people's partisan attachments. So we know, for example, that Americans who have more traditionalist views about gender roles in society have disproportionately much more likely to be Republicans. Feminists and those who are more equalitarian when it comes to gender tend to be Democratic. But the context of elections matter with respect to how those views, in fact, exert an independent effect on people's voter choices here. And so let me just cite two recent studies that kind of put this in, I think, to illuminates this kind of tendency. So my friends Aaron Cassess and Tiffany Barnes did a really interesting article after the 2016 election. A lot of people thought that with Donald Trump entering the race against the first historic major party nominee, Hillary Clinton, that would bring a lot of women over to vote for the Democratic side of the party. And they really kind of tamped that down because they found in their analysis in the 2016 election race, looking at white women voters in particular, that a lot of white women have sexist views. And in fact, those views, even controlling for partisanship and other things that we control for when we want to understand people's voting, really did have an independent effect. Notably, though, why the study is really interesting is that they replicated that in 2012. And this was an election, of course, featuring Barack Obama, Mitt Romney, two male candidates. And even though those white women voters had those same sexist beliefs, it didn't really manifest as an independent factor, right? So there has to be some sort of mechanism involved that really highlights, I think, gender attitudes in a campaign. And I think turning to this election in 2024, Trump facing a female nominee again, using what I would argue is some of the most hyper-masculine rhetoric I can ever recall in a modern campaign, we're seeing that gender attitudes, I think, really were probably a factor in this election. So, for example, in our 2024 data that we just released here, going back to this question of, whether we often ask at PRRI, Americans, do you think society is too soft and feminine, right? So in 2024, we found that 85% of Americans who agree society is too soft and feminine voted for Trump this election cycle, compared to just 13% who voted for Kamala Harris. In 2020, though, even though most of those voters who think America is become too soft and feminine voted for Trump, it was only 74%, and 1 in 4 of those voters voted for Joe Biden. I think the point here is that there has to be some kind of mechanism that tends to push, the levers for caring about gender into people's voting calculus. And I think in this election cycle, we really, really saw that happening. Final comments are on the youth vote here, and then also talking about the gender gap within the youth vote. So really, since 2012, about 6 in 10 young people, voters aged 18 to 29, have voted for Democrats, right? So that's been a pretty consistent pattern that we've seen. And in 2020, only 37% of young voters voted for Donald Trump, according to validated voter files. There's 37%. And no matter how you slice it, if you're looking at our data set and other exit polls, Trump really did make a lot of inroads with the youth vote. Our data show an even split, 49% to 49%. Other exit polls show about a winnowing of about 6% among the youth vote in terms of Harris over Donald Trump. Also, during that time from 2012 to 2016 to 2020, about 2/3 roughly of women voters have tended to vote for young women, have voted for Democrats, whereas Trump and Republicans have never garnered a majority of votes from young men. That changed, though, in this election. Harris did pretty well with young women voters. I mean, our survey data finds that 59% voted for Kamala Harris, but really a pretty solid majority of young men voted for Donald Trump. It went up to 59% in our survey results. Other analyses that break that down, we don't have enough cases of young men of color in our sample to kind of parse that out, but really it's young white men especially that have been drawn to Donald Trump in this election. But other exit polls show 35% of young Black men and 49% of young Latino men decided to vote for Donald Trump this election cycle. So why is this the case? And I'll really briefly explain my thoughts on this. One, I think it's the economy. I mean, this is a fundamentals election. Exit polls show that 4 in 10 Americans young people cited the economy as being the most important factor in their voting decision. I think a lot of people suspected that abortion would play a bigger role this election cycle. And in the midterms in 2022, 44% of young people said that that was their most important voting factor. It really dropped to about 13% to the election cycle. And finally, is there anything to be made to the fact that maybe young men are becoming more sexist, right? Has the manosphere and the Tradwise phenomenon brought us this idea that suddenly we see young men becoming a lot more traditionalist in their gender roles, and that played a role in Trump's success with those voters? I think the jury is really out. It's something I'm going to be monitoring moving forward. I will say this. I went back and looked in our archives, and that society is too soft and feminine question. In 2016, we found about 49% of young men agreed with that tendency, young women far less. This election cycle, it bumped up to 57% of young men agreeing with that. Young women have tended not to agree with that. In fact, from 2016, their levels of agreement have dropped. And that kind of corresponds with my book's research on really how Gen Z women have become the most liberal constituency in the American electorate. But nonetheless, I think it's something we're going to have to grapple with moving forward, how young men found Trump so appealing in this election cycle. And whether that's a Trump effect, kind of getting back to sort of Efrén's point about, the brand of Trump, is that something unique to Trump, or is it something that's going to last longer? So we'll have to see. All right. Wow, we've taken up a lot of time already. So I want to get back to some questions here that were raised by Chris and some points raised by Efrén. So I don't know, Robbie, if you wanted to maybe jump in. Chris had some really good questions about Christian nationalism and differences among Black and white Christian nationalists. I know that we've done some research in that area. So I just wanted you to get a chance to respond to Chris's point.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I'm glad you raised it, Chris. So, it's certainly the case that there is a minority of African-American Protestants and African-Americans that affirm these kind of tenets of Christian nationalism. But what's interesting about it is that even if we start to compare what work that attitudinal orientation does in other space, what you see is exactly what you're pointing to. Like, the African-American church has its roots in separating itself from white churches, right? That's the reason why we have even the term Black church, which is a little bit of a weird thing, but makes sense because of our history, right? Because African Americans separated themselves from whites after the Civil War when they had the ability to do that and form their own churches, their own denominations, which meant that those theological affirmations that they shared with white Christians actually began to do very different social and political work in those African-American spaces. And we see the same thing happening here. So just give a couple of examples. Even if we compare African-Americans who score high on the Christian nationalism scale to whites who score high on the Christian nationalism scale, it doesn't, for example, African Americans who score high on the Christian nationalism scale are only slightly more likely to be Republican, whereas whites who score high are like wildly more likely. So it doesn't predict partisanship in the same way it does among whites. The other things where it does not operate the same way, it does not predict anti-immigrant attitudes the way it does among whites. So even those African Americans who score high on the Christian nationalism scale are less likely to hold anti-immigrant views than whites who score high on the Christian nationalism scale. Anti-Muslim attitudes as well, and obviously questions about race and racial equality. So all that means that sort of, even though they may share this kind of views, they interpret them differently, right? And they move in different political and social spaces, even if they're holding those same views on the surface.
Can I just say something real quick? The reason why that jumped out at me, Robbie and Melissa and Efrén, is because if you look at the distribution, if you look at the Christian nationalism scale and the distribution by race, like it's pretty evenly distributed by race.
Yep.
Right. So that shocked me. Right. But it also gets back to something Efrén did a little while ago on looking at examining authoritarianism and showing that it means something different, for Black folks than it does for white folks.
Yeah.
The sort of lack of, I'm going to use a technical term here, invariance.
Yeah. I mean, if I was going to boil it down, I mean, I think the key difference is that for whites who score high on the Christian nationalism scale, what is sort of behind it is a real sense of dominance, political dominance, right? To the exclusion of other people, and that's never been a strong tenet in the Black church. So,
Chris, I'm going to kind of play off of this set of questions here and ask you a little bit about the role of the Black church here. And I want to pivot to younger voters because this is what I'm writing about and thinking about a lot. It's pretty clear, however you look at the data, whether it's our current survey here or looking at some exit polls, that Trump did make inroads especially with Black male voters, younger Black men, not to the extent I think that nowhere near majority, right? But I'm just kind of curious, is there a connection potentially with the fact that younger Black folks are less religious, or how this kind of all plays into the equation here? So what's your take on why, Trump may have made inroads with younger Black voters this election cycle?
Well, with younger Black males specifically, right? And one of the things that we found in my own survey work with my partner, Chris, is that there's a lot of misogyny involved. So in wave 3 of our survey, we actually found we took us for a while to find a misogyny scale, because what we saw in the modern sexism scales, and the several of them that are, it wasn't sort of faithful to what we were hearing in our focus groups. So we went to misogyny, and that's essentially what it is. So you have misogyny and basically political ignorance, right, that help drive support for Trump among younger Black men.
Efrén, I want to pivot a bit here. One of the things that I thought was interesting about your comments, this brand of Trump, I think it's a really good thing to think about. To what extent is this a blip election in which Trump is such a unique figure that it really drew more support disproportionately than we typically see? Or is this actually a realignment, right, where we see Latino voters, in fact, finding the GOP more appealing? But linked to that, though, I wanted to ask you about sort of the role of cultural issues here for Latino voters, right? There's always, I think, been this perception that, well, Latinos will eventually become Republican because they're more conservative on LGBTQ issues or gender roles, or et cetera. So I'm just kind of curious your thoughts on the role of culture in bringing Latinos to vote more Republican this election cycle, or do you think that's really missing the larger picture?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a great question, because it has to do with what people bring to the table, and then what is it about politics that allows them to connect that to public affairs. So I think there's sort of another sort of trend that is happening at the same time. So the first one that I mentioned was with the two parties polarizing. One of the major dimensions that they're polarizing on are essentially culture issues, right? What do we do about LGBTQ politics? What do we do about race, et cetera? And so part of why that's important, you only have two choices in our political menu. And so if the parties are essentially splitting on that dimension, it means that you have content that you can bring to the table, right? If you see that Republicans are increasingly anti-LGBTQ, and that's sort of the conversation, and you happen to be LGBTQ, then of course you pick the correct sort of party. And so, that's sort of one trend. But the other one that is happening that I think a lot of political observers and even professional political scientists are falling asleep at the wheel at is the Latino population itself is dramatically different from what it was in the 80s and even the 90s. I mean, we still have this inertia in thinking about them as primarily immigrant, right? And that's sort of how Democrats have often reached out to them. And the reality is that at this point in time, it's a native-born conversation. 3 out of 5 Latinos tend to be born in the US. The reason that matters is that, they're also increasingly trying to figure out, where do I fit in this racial terrain? And where do I fit in this partisan terrain? And so the reason that I think, that question about, is it Trump effect or elect or sort of a realignment is, we need to sort of do a better job of tracking these same individuals over time in order for us to draw sort of firmer conclusions about whether it is truly a partisan realignment. I'm doubtful that that's sort of the case, because every election tends to change a bit in terms of what are the terms of the debate. The last two have definitely been about things like the role of women in public and private life. What place or position do racial and ethnic minorities sort of occupy? But it doesn't always have to be that way. And so in order for this to be a more durable shift, we'd have to make the assumption that that's always going to sort of be the case. And I'm unclear. The last thing I'll say is, to Chris's point about the role of misogyny plus political ignorance, that's sort of I think, nicer, more incisive way to talk about what I was trying to refer to as far as an explanation for Latino support for Trump. When you don't pay consistent attention to politics, when you're not consistently aware or engaged, which is the case with very many busy Latino people, any new shiny object is going to look quite attractive. And that's sort of what you can think of as Trump, a new shiny object. And did they get duped? I hate to sound judgmental, but in some ways, yeah, when you don't have the background information to make high stakes decisions, this is what happened with Latinos. But I would also say this is what happened with the small segments of other populations that we consider sort of like, how are they voting against their interest? Well, it's easy when you don't have sort of the items to sort of connect and make a very important decision. And that's not a feature of Latinos. That's actually a feature of large segments of the American mass public.
Yeah, building on that, Efrén, we have a question from a good friend of PRRI, Jamar Tisby, on the issue of political ignorance. He asked, does the survey shed any light on the role of misinformation or news sources in 2024 presidential election voting patterns? I think one of the things that social scientists like us have really have yet to grapple with really systematically is looking at the fragmentation of media information, right? We don't live in a world where everyone's watching 3 nightly news, channels an evening. I mean, we know too with Gen Z, we've seen this in some of our own data, that very, very few Zoomers are in fact watching television news or cable news, right? For better or for worse, younger people, and I think increasingly more and more Americans are really getting their information on social media and through podcasts. And so coming up, I think, with better measures of that is going to be really, really important. And we're just starting to really unpack how younger voters in particular are really they're getting most of their information again from podcasts, and so we have to kind of figure out, I think, a better way of handling that. But Jamar, that's something we'll take a look at when we do more deeper dives of our data over the next month with this survey. I have a question. Yeah, please.
Just real quickly on that. I mean, one thing that does stand out to me on the news, so we have asked about both television news and other sources, but it is remarkable that there's one group that actually stands out that sort of still does watch television news, and they tend to watch mainstream network news, and those are African Americans. So actually, I'll say 72% of African Americans say they primarily get their news from mainstream, like MSM, or not MSNBC, NBC, CBS, CNN, like the kind of center kind of news organizations, and they kind of stand out And that way, that's like, and so if you compare that to Latinos, it's only 45% of Latinos, for example, who say that, but 72% of African Americans still do.
So Robbie, a question for you from another friend of PRRI, Terry Conley. He says, is there any evidence in the data that the rather successful reassertion of raw political power by white Christians in America correlates with an increase in personal identification as a white Christian among Americans generally? Or are they still a shrinking percentage of the population that is just taking advantage of quirks in our constitutional system that can lead to minority rule? So I just wanted to
Sure.
Quickly.
Yeah. So what we're finding is that this will be remarkable maybe because if you look at the way that Trump particularly has amplified the power of white conservative Christians, you wouldn't know this, but it is true today that the percentage of the population that identifies as white and Christian continues to shrink. So a book I wrote in 2016 called The End of White Christian America tracked the first time we had moved from majority to non-majority white Christian country, and that happened during Barack Obama's presidency. I don't think it's any coincidence that we see a kind of backlash among conservative white Christians after the Obama presidency as well. That number, so it went from 54% to 47% during Barack Obama's presidency. That's all white Christians in the country. That number today is 41%, right? So it's continued to decline. And if we look at white evangelical Protestants, here's the real kicker. They are only 13% of the population, white evangelical Protestants. They're the same size as the white non-evangelical Protestants and essentially the same size as white Catholics today. They're all about 12, 13% of the population. However, they do exercise outsized presence at the polls because they turn out to vote at higher rates than others. So my best estimates is that they're 13% of the population, but about 18 or 19% of the electorate because of differential turnout rates.
Great. We only have a minute or so left. I wanted to give Efrén and Chris maybe the last words in terms of big takeaways of what you're going to be looking at as we head in to 2025 based on some of the survey findings here. Maybe Efrén, then Chris.
Yeah, so I mean, I think one of the big things to watch out for right when President Trump comes to his second term is what happens when he pushes through a lot of the big bang sort of anti-minority proposals that he offered, primarily sort of the mass deportations, right? And I think that's when you're going to see a lot of the cards sort of fall on the floor for people that were voting for this candidate on the basis of one thing and sort of ignoring or downplaying that part of the package was a policy move such as this one. And so that's sort of what I'll be watching for is the reaction among affected communities to this pretty draconian measure, if you ask me. And so, I don't want to see it, but high probability that, it's going to be pretty messy.
And I'll just add very quickly that, for the politically ignorant, of which, Efrén just spelled it out very nicely and elaborating on it, like these people just don't know the facts. They either didn't want to know about Trump and his administration, or they just didn't know, right? One is an act of omission, the other is an act of commission, but especially for those for which it was an act of commission, remaining ignorant, I want to see how they react, right? When they're affected, especially in the Black community, how they react to this. Like they're going to get a political education real quick. And I want to see how they respond to this.
Robbie, last thoughts from you before we close up?
Well, I mean, I guess I'll go back to the only post-election public piece I've written was called "What White Christians Have Wrought," and I just say that the only reason we're still talking about Donald Trump in 2024 is because of kind of one ethno-religious group, right? It's white Christian voters. So we can parse all the tiny little numbers of who shifted 4 or 5, 6 points this way or that, but it's white Christians voting in super majorities that have put him on the ballot in the first place back in 2016, that have kept him on the ballot and have kept him sweeping the Republican primaries, everyone else aside the whole time. So I just don't want to lose this is a don't lose the forest for the trees kind of comment, but it is, that's really what's going on how do we end up with Trump? Well, it's white Christian voters that put him in the White House again.
Thank you for those final thoughts. For those of you who joined us today, we're really grateful you spent the time. There's going to be much more research ahead. Please take a look at our website, PRRI.org, for more analysis of this really rich and important data set. I'd like to thank Efrén and Chris for joining us today and sharing their insights. I'd also like to thank all the folks who asked questions. We didn't nearly get enough time to answer them or address them. I feel like a lot of them have given us marching orders on ways to look at the data, parental status, LGBTQ Americans. So we're going to take good note of that and take a deeper dive as we head into the new year. Thank you again. Follow our work at PRI Poll, at Blue Sky, Threads, on LinkedIn. We're really grateful that you spent the time with us today.